some of the work that the Enrich Project has shown is the distribution of landfills and waste disposal sites relative to racialized communities. And so, and this is an exercise that in the U.S. kind of was done in the 90s nationally, which is looking at the geographic overlap between landfills and communities of color. And now these same types of mapping exercises and such are being deployed in Canada in just the last handful of years. And so what this map is showing is a map of Nova Scotia, and in red are all of the waste disposal sites. And then in gold, these dots are showing the communities that are part of the Mi'kmaq First Nation and then African Nova Scotian communities. And so what you can see is that there's a large geographic overlap between those red and those gold dots. Indicating that the placement of these waste disposal sites are geographically correlated with racialized communities. And that's not the only example of where you have this overlap occurring. And another example of this is in Canada's Chemical Valley. And Canada's Chemical Valley is Sarnia, Ontario. And what you have in Sarnia is a very acute concentration of Canada's chemical industry. So 40% of Canada's chemical industry is in this area, and you actually see very kind of marked health effects due to the concentration of chemical facilities there. So for instance, in Sarnia, there's over a 3 times higher level of acute myeloid leukemia. And what we also see is that in the same area is where the Anjinand First Nation is based. And the Anjinand First Nation has been experiencing this disproportionate burden of Canada's chemical pollution and has been fighting against this for a number of years. And this was a news article from earlier this year discussing how the Canadian government and the Anjinand First Nation are now working together to try to address these disproportionate exposures that their nation is facing. And the reason for this is because last June, the Canadian Parliament passed a new law that recognizes environmental racism and seeks to address it. So according to this new law, and this is just text straight from the bill, a disproportionate number of people who live in environmentally hazardous areas are members of Indigenous, racialized, or other marginalized communities in Canada. So this is the government very directly acknowledging that environmental racism exists in Canada, and that the establishment of these environmentally hazardous sites and polluting facilities in areas that are in communities that are predominantly Indigenous and other racialized groups is a form of discrimination. And so this law also establishes that the Minister of Environment will develop a national strategy that seeks to address these issues. And so when it comes to environmental justice, the Canadian government acknowledges that there's not one definition of environmental justice that is going to work for everybody, but environmental justice is a movement that's seeking to ensure fair and meaningful inclusion of affected people when it comes to environmental benefits and environmental burdens. So to try to address those inequalities of who is being overburdened by exposures, and then also the lack of the inequality when it comes to environmental benefits as well. And so The Canadian definition of environmental justice is also really similar to that. That's been deployed in the United States for decades. In the US, the most kind of common definition of environmental justice is that it's a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, national origin, etc., when it comes to the implementation and enforcement of environmental laws and policies, and that there will be this equitable distribution of environmental benefits. And so, the important thing to point out when it comes to this definition of environmental justice, this is about justice for all people. It's not only for people of color and racialized communities, it's just that in order to achieve environmental justice, we have to address the existing inequalities, and those existing inequalities tend to be those disproportionate burdens on racialized communities and other marginalized groups. And so I'm actually going to skip that slide, but I'll leave it for your reference. When we think about environmental justice overall, there's kind of a framework. There are multiple frameworks that exist, but there are four main pillars that are typically accepted within the environmental justice movement. And these pillars are distributive justice, so that's that kind of fair allocation of benefits and burdens. Then there's also procedural justice, which is the inclusion of all people in decision-making processes. And then corrective justice, which is really to try to compensate for historical harms. And then social justice, which is really recognizing that, as I discussed in that introduction slide, environment is just one component of a larger ecosystem when it comes to matters of social justice, and you can't tease apart you can't separate environmental justice from other aspects of social justice because they're so largely intertwined and because it tends to be the same communities that are facing injustice. And so just with my last couple minutes, I wanted to mention that climate justice is also an area that has emerged, I would say, over the last 10 years or so. And climate justice really comes as a derivative from environmental justice, but is focused on climate change. And so there are 6 pillars when it comes to, and actually I should mention, so the definition of climate justice. So now this is seeking to recognize the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities and people of color around the world, and also acknowledging that those people and communities that are going to be most affected by the impacts of climate change are also those that have done the least to contribute to climate change. And so the pillars of climate justice are similar to EJ, but they have some differences. So we have a just transition, we have social, racial, and environmental justice. Indigenous climate action is a very important component here. Climate education and engagement, natural climate solutions, and community resilience and adaptation. And I wanted to flag for you that it's really important as we consider climate adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation being the ways that we anticipate and prepare for climate change and try to make our communities more resilient, our infrastructure more resilient, and climate mitigation being the ways that we try to mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in the move to mitigate climate change, we've seen that there are new environmental justice issues that have popped up. And we tend to call these within the environmental justice movement false solutions. So these are solutions to climate change that then continue to perpetuate injustice. And some of these include carbon capture and storage, hydrogen energy, mineral mining, geothermal, etc. But I wanted to flag for you just one example, which is carbon capture and storage. This is from the Center for International Environmental Law, which points out that essentially the infrastructure that will be used to actually store carbon is, being planned and also is currently being built up in communities who have already been overburdened by environmental hazards. So, think of the kind of Sarnia type communities where, now we're just building a new type of infrastructure that has its own environmental risks, health and safety risks, and a number of other reasons that it can be problematic and why it's considered a false solution. But also, one of the other things to consider when we're thinking about environmental justice, environmental racism, and climate justice is that when we have new technologies, we also have to consider, are we just offshoring environmental racism? So one example of this is when it comes to EV batteries, um, and that the mining of cobalt that it's used by EVs, which, in countries like Canada and the US, we kind of tout electric vehicles as like, okay, we need to get more electric vehicles on the road. And then also, simultaneously addressing environmental racism domestically, where some of these solutions that we're using domestically are just offshoring environmental racism to other countries. And so with that, I will turn it over to the other panelists to build more on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Today. Thank you, Michaela, for that presentation. Thank you to everyone here and to the association for giving me a chance to come meet and gather with you here today. It's a real privilege. I think the topic you've chosen for yourself of the relationship of economic development and environmental protection and the longstanding tensions in that relationship as they have intensified, and our conventional ways of managing those tensions and contradictions are in upheaval is the right thing to be talking about. I enjoyed the debate on this yesterday, although I do wonder if I've been doing debate wrong. Where I'm from, there tend to be a little more fractious and contentious and hard feelings, so it's kind of nice to be here and see people get along well. I'm going to situate the question, that kind of large question, with respect to greenwashing and some of the anti-greenwashing provisions in competition law. Kind of maybe unfamiliar, perhaps an odd place to think about development, environmental tensions and contradictions. But I think it's an important one because it's a place where we see a strong commitment to information integrity in public communication. And as well, I think the ways in which we've traditionally thought about competition as necessary to development and environmental protection is worth kind of bringing into the foreground as we think about building quicker, moving faster, these kinds of things. So you all know about the upheaval. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this other than to say, there's the Trump of it all. There's Carney's approach to these things. These really are challenging the ways we've traditionally thought about rules, regulations, laws, these types of things. And they're really being, for many groups, framed as impediments to innovation, impediments to being able to deliver on public will. And this is something I think we're going to have to grapple with and think a little bit about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of how the greenwashing laws took shape and how people have responded to them. So in terms of what it is, I like Ren Montgomery's definition that greenwashing is communication that misleads people into adopting overly positive beliefs about an organization's environmental performance, practices, or products. So Ren, if you're not familiar with her, and I don't know how familiar we are all with competition law, is probably the leading scholar of this at Western University. Now, greenwashing used to be simple, pretty boring, not really worth our time, frankly. A company would create a message, that exaggerates the environmental qualities of a product or service that would mislead consumer decision making. We could usually see these ads. They were visible to all in the nightly news, the Globe and Mail, bus shelters, these types of things. There was long-standing laws in place to protect consumers from this sort of deception. And this is especially important with environmentally friendly products and claims because consumers do value these highly. There's a strong incentive to make these claims because consumers will pay for these types of things. They will support these kinds of things publicly, but they often can't tell whether the claims are valid simply by owning something or using it. So, as one example, you can't really verify the sustainability of your yoga pants if you buy them from a well-known Vancouver-based company simply by wearing them or owning them. You don't know you can't tell by just having that product whether they're sustainably sourced, produced, what their supply chain is like. So this is a very old problem. Snake oil salesmen have always existed. I don't think it's really that difficult to deal with, but greenwashing isn't really that anymore. It's much more complicated, and the practice has really sprawled and become a part of strategic communication for a wide variety of actors trying to manage stakeholders and public expectations more widely through green and climate communication. So it really isn't about consumers. It's really more about managing information and expectations of investors, shareholders, journalists, politicians, financial institutions, policymakers, governments, many of which still do offer valuable incentives for businesses that forward sustainable environmental stewardship, climate protection goals, even today. So I think yesterday we heard how important it is to show concern for environmental impacts in developmental projects. And whether that's associating a project itself or an organization itself with environmental stewardship and sustainability, environmental responsibility. And so businesses are highly incentivized to project this image of their project and of themselves, and they should when that is earned. But the same incentive is in place for businesses and developers that do not actually do that work, but that still want to come across as having that image. And so this is something when there's no penalties in place or no enforcement in place, the incentives can kind of encourage that kind of aspirational or speculative set of claims about environmental protection. And in many cases, those claims have nothing to do with a product or service, which is the traditional way in which greenwashing has been thought about and for which laws and law enforcement has typically thought about it as a problem. These claims are more general representations of environmental performance of a business in general. So it's not that the yoga pants are sustainable or good for the planet, it's that Lululemon might be. I'm just picking on them because I'm in Vancouver and I walked past the Lululemon shop the other day. We could think of other examples that we could pick on. But this is a more difficult example, I think, to think about. And the tools that we traditionally had don't really help law enforcement and the laws we have and the law enforcement techniques that are available. So it's a much more complicated situation when a company's not promoting a claim about its performance. So still, to get even a little more complex with it, this is an example from the oil patch. Anyone familiar with Pathways Alliance? Is this a well-known organization? See a few nods out there. It's been very tough, I think, to avoid their advertising depending on when you live. But when a company isn't actually promoting a claim about its performance, but it's about its future aspirations. And so when you widen the temporal scale of the activity that's covered by its promise to be different in the future, when a company or an entire industrial sector begins to promise to be climate friendly, not now, not tomorrow, not next week, next month, but sort of in 2030 and certainly by 2050, how do you kind of assess that type of claim to be carbon neutral or net zero? And as those claims proliferated, not that long ago, pretty much every carbon major located in the Western world was making those kinds of claims. It became a difficult question of how to assess these and whether deceptive marketing was a tool for addressing this type of thing. So we're not dealing with communication about a product or service, that's obvious. It's not clear in those cases how to tell if a business operation or wider performance of a company is as represented. I did an investigation into Pathways Alliance with some colleagues. It took a very long time to do that. And it's not easy to assess if these claims are material because they're not really shaping consumer decision making. They're really about securing social license. So last year, new anti-greenwashing provisions were passed with amendments to the Competition Act. And this happened after a lot of consultation, hearings with experts, and really some of these tools were at the request of the Commissioner of the Competition Bureau, who had taken an interest in addressing greenwashing, had been much more vocal about warning consumers about this type of thing, warning the public about this type of thing, signaling an intention to enforce laws around it, and was asking for more tools to be able to deal with some of the complicated situations that he was finding landing on his desk. And they introduced, I would say, quite a stir. The key provisions include any commercial promotion of a green claim around a business interest would now be covered. So it's not just goods and services. If you make a claim about the nature of your business operations or business performance, that would be covered, and those needed to be truthful whether or not they were material. So it's nice to be here with lawyers. I don't have to probably tell you what material means. That's a nice thing for me. But basically, it doesn't have to be significant enough to affect decision making. You don't have to show that. It just needs to be true or false. That's the determination there. Companies, all companies, regardless of sector, that make a green claim for promotional purposes now need to have evidence for that claim. So this is the change. This is called the reverse onus provision. This is the one that was requested by the commissioner to aid with the investigations, because it's very difficult to prove something is false in these situations if there's simply no evidence. And so what the request for the reverse onus was to say that if you make a claim, and you do not have to make green claims, you do not have to make environmental claims, you do not have to make climate claims, but if you decide to do so, you have to have evidence for that claim. And the idea was that that would aid investigations, increase the pace at which those kinds of things would happen. And although this is not the case in Canada, but if made visible and transparent to individuals, it might aid their decision-making or ability to engage in the market. The trickiest part of all this is not simply that all claims are now covered and that you need to have evidence for what you say if you make an environmental promotion or claim, but that they need to be in accord with internationally recognized standards. And this is what created a lot of contention, because this is a relatively new idea. And at the outset, and arguably still today, it's not clear what standards count or how to have your evidence consistent with or derived from those standards. And so that introduced quite a lot of uncertainty into this space. What I've learned is legal uncertainty. I've learned that's actually scarier than anything, scarier than Trumps and tariffs and these kinds of things, to have legal uncertainty for developers and investors. And this is certainly a real legitimate concern, I would say, as people have tried to figure out what's going on. And there's been quite a bit of discussion around lawyers that work in this space to help people understand what's happening. And as well, there's a private right of standing for individuals to be empowered to bring forward complaints. So as this law went into effect last year, several oil and gas organizations, which were very prominent, removed their environmental and climate protection claims, their net zero claims, including the organization I showed you earlier, Pathways Alliance. This is a screenshot from Imperial Oil, majority owned by ExxonMobil, who's a member of Pathways Alliance. They were initially called Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero. So this is a group of companies, six companies forming about 95% of the production in the oil sands. They came together to put forward a climate action plan, and it was pulled down in response to the law. So you might say that's a good first day for the law if you believe that those were false, baseless representations that were being made. I'm not opposed to that interpretation. There's certainly a lot less claims of this sort in the Canadian space as a result, but it certainly wasn't everyone's reaction to what was going on. And this is kind of where I want to land the presentation and talk a little bit about this. So there were basically 4 reactions to what's happening. And I think these reactions are important as we start to think about more widely what our reactions are going to be to rules, regulations, laws that pertain to environmental and climate protection as these become contested with respect to moving faster, building better, these types of questions. We're going to have to figure out how we deal with the public discussion and the tendencies in the public discussion that sort of lands on these efforts as we begin to govern differently, if Mark Harney is sincere about that claim. So what are they? The first reaction here at the top involves the significant legal uncertainty that bringing forward a new law entails. Environmental promotion now required evidence. The system for generating and assessing that evidence was unclear, and this was the new thing businesses had to do. And businesses are usually busy. They're usually already dealing with conditions of uncertainty. And so this introduced a whole lot of other uncertainty about something that they might not have been thinking a whole lot about previously. And this is just kind of a process that's now the Competition Bureau, I think, has done okay in speeding through their public consultations. I would say those happen very quickly, and then using those to develop guidelines for people to make these kinds of claims in the public marketplace. And I think that is about 80% good, and it's kind of worth our time and worth continuing to think about. And that has helped reduce some of the uncertainty that's happening there. And how you feel about that probably depends on whether you thought the market was flooded with false environmental and climate claims that were really producing cynicism around whether this type of thing was working, whether businesses could be a legitimate partner in climate protection, or whether you did not really see that as a problem at all. The second reaction kind of follows from the first, and it suggests that the law would encourage green hushing. I don't know how familiar people are with green hushing, but this is when people keep quiet about the legitimate environmental work they're doing, or instead of like promoting the things they've done to protect environment, to protect climate, and to advance that in their businesses, they refuse to talk about it at all. And some of this involves that the law landed in a conversation where there are just tons of other sorts of requirements around sustainability reporting, all kinds of like different, especially for larger financial organizations, all kinds of like categorizations and ways to think about this. And so for some, I think it felt like just another system that was different that they would have to learn to adapt to and use. And some were suggesting that people would just not bother. They would just not bother talking about environment and about climate concerns. And I think there's something worth talking about there. The third and fourth reactions, which I'm going to compress for the purposes of time, don't articulate that concern in the language of green hushing or in terms of legal uncertainty, but use the language of silencing, censorship, intimidation, freedom of speech and expression, essentially suggesting that deceptive marketing laws to maintain fair competition in the marketplace to try to avoid harms to consumers and other businesses, they aren't laws there to protect economic competition. They're expressions of authoritarian overreach by a government that doesn't like certain industrial sectors and is using laws to bully or intimidate and even potentially put some of the people in those sectors in jail. And this is a part of the discussion that did emerge. There are still people that hold this view, have these anxieties and fears. And that language of political escalation around instances of rules, regulations, rule of law, I think is deeply concerning to me. The depictions of professionals, of lawyers, that populist actors sometimes generate to attempt to kill laws they do not like or is unfavorable. It's something I'm not sure we're going to be able to avoid. We see a lot of this down south. We see instances of it in this case happening here, falling into a kind of polarized debate between certain corporate actors that are located in Alberta and what they call Ottawa. And when you recall that Carney's first action as a prime minister was to kill the consumer carbon tax, which was a contentious issue, went all the way to the Supreme Court and was found constitutional. We all heard too much about the carbon tax, I would say. There was an effort to kind of make the election campaign turn on that issue. And when Carney tore it down, when Carney took down the consumer piece of it, he said it had become too politically divisive. And so there's a concern there that becoming politically divisive can be part of the strategy to address laws that someone might not like. So I think this is something we're going to have to figure out. I think we're clearly going to build stuff. People I heard in the room today want to build stuff in the right way. I think that's going to have to include a way to think about environmental and climate protection. And we need to find a way in which good information integrity can be part of that. And I think there is a place for rules, laws, regulations to support that. So I'm going to leave it there. I very much look forward to the next presentation in particular and to the conversation we're about to have. Thank you.
It's a real honor to be here. I'm Suzanne Simard. I'm a professor of forest ecology at UBC, University of British Columbia. I come from a family of horse loggers, and I've worked in the forest sector for a long, long time and currently working with First Nations people primarily. This talk is about forests, and I'm going to show you lots of beautiful pictures of forests. And I want to talk about the history of forests and forestry and how law has impacted forests, and then how law can also play an important role in mitigating climate change and biodiversity law, or biodiversity laws. And I just wanted to also, before I get into it too much, is to say land use change in particular is responsible for about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So what we do in forests is super important for emissions, and nature-based solutions can actually mitigate climate change by 25 to 50% according to scientists. So that's just a little preamble. So forests globally are super important. They cover about 1/3 of the terrestrial land area, hold up to 80% of terrestrial carbon pools, home to about 80% of biodiversity, and in Canada are the source of 80% of our clean water. And importantly, are the home to about 80% of ancestral homes of Indigenous people. Canada is extremely species rich, and particularly important because we're at the northern limit of many species distributions, so therefore very important in migration of species. This is a temperate rainforest, home to many species you're familiar with, many species that are on the brink of extinction, including the marbled murrelet, the northern goshawk, the sea wolf, the spirit bear, and so on. Now, Indigenous people have been the original stewards of this land. They migrated according to recent ancient DNA analysis across the Beringia about 17,000 years ago, and the oldest civilizations are along the Pacific coast, including on Haida Gwaii. The Haida talk about that their lineage dates back 16,000 years or time immemorial. Over this long period of time, complex Indigenous societies have developed around natural laws, which laws coming from the land and the waters, and they uphold these laws today in their origin stories, languages, hereditary lineages, and social institutions. These natural laws are grounded in the natural energy that flows in everything, the sacred spirit and all the trees, the animals, the water, the air, and this energy, as I said, is sacred. And it tells us that we're all connected together, and that ultimately our health is connected to these forests, our communities, and the whole global community. And these are rooted in these connections in respect for one another, respectful relationships that are deeply connected, based on the ideal of reciprocity, that there is a give and take among people and the more than human world. That there is a responsibility of care to not just ourselves and each other, but to the entire world. And from that comes resilience. And this worldview has created historically abundance and wealth in our forests. Let me give you one example. The First Nations people along the Pacific coast used ancient passive fishing technologies, and I'm going to talk about the tidal stone trap system. That system was a system of care and observation and monitoring, where salmon were passively harvested based on the ebb tides and the moon cycles, and that only the salmon that were small were harvested, and the big abundant fish were left to go upstream spawn. And this practice produced large fish and large populations and increased salmon populations. The people were extremely important in this, and moving salmon also into the forest to fertilize their food systems. And along with that, they helped with the bears and the eagles and the wolves, who also were carrying salmon into these forests. And so these forests now today, we measure in my lab that these are some of the largest carbon stocks in the world, are these salmon forests. There are about 2,000 tons of carbon per hectare in these forests, compared to about 1,000 in the Amazon rainforest. Now, when the European colonists came to the shores of North America, they found this abundance and wealth. And they employed the doctrine of discovery to start laying stake to these lands and these resources. This enabled them or the terra nullius, the vacant land doctrine, enabled them to basically take over sovereignty, title, and jurisdiction over this land. And the sovereignty of Indigenous nations were invalidated in that process. So then the colonial government handed over the jurisdiction of forests to the provinces, while that of the fisheries, the oceans, the species, the air, and the First Nations themselves fell under federal jurisdiction, essentially separating the people from the land. And also the philosophy of care changed from respect, balance, creating abundance to one of objectification, exploitation, and scarcity. And so it's within this context I want to talk about what's happened to our forests, to the forests of Canada. So forestry started in the Maritimes about 500 years ago and started to become a concern in BC in the early 1900s as harvesting started to happen. And it was really evident early on that there was over-harvesting and deforestation. A Canadian Forest Service was established in 1899 to respond to this emerging crisis. And then the BC Forest Act was established in 1912 to basically regulate the harvest. But what it really did is it identified a timber harvesting land base which regulated the harvest. It also passed laws for administering the rights, properties, and the royalties that went to the Crown, including the cutting of all timber. Notably, Indigenous people were left out of this entire calculation, as were the local people. And the idea was to liquidate the old-growth forest. They were considered overmature and decadent and converted to a normal forest, what Europeans call a normal forest or forest plantations. These are not forests. We know now through our research they're biological deserts and they are very carbon poor. As this unfolded, there was a huge response in the public and also in the government. And they called many commissions, royal commissions over the years to introduce concepts of long-run sustained yield, which was to regulate the cut so that it was kept, so that we only cut as much as was grown back. That was actually not followed, but regeneration standards were set, conservation was established, there was a profession of forestry established. And notably, Indigenous people were left out of all of these conversations along the way. And of course, globally, things were happening. In 1986, the United Nations established the Brundtland Commission, which looked at environmental degradation and got countries on board. BC in particular paid attention and they amended the Forest Act and they brought people into the equation, but they still encouraged cutting the forest at a pretty rapid rate. And through the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, the harvest rate was very high and it was ultimately leading to what's called the fall down effect. At this time, the War in the Woods broke out in about 1993, where Indigenous people, especially the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation, gathered together with environmentalists to protest this logging. And it kind of worked in a way in that the Great Bear Rainforest was created, but in essence, it leaked the harvesting over to interior forests. Many things also happened around that time. The appertency provision was removed, which required timber licenses to have local mills. There was an unduly clause implemented, meaning that no more than 4% of the cut could be affected by biodiversity, which was considered a constraint. Large companies were consolidated, the overseas log market was opened up, and most of the harvesting was done with clear cutting. In about 2020 or 2022, when Eby became the premier, he looked around and he said, our forests are exhausted. He was right. And so at the same time, my group and many other groups were monitoring what's going on in the land. And we found that clear cutting like this was actually causing 60 to 70% carbon losses and large losses in biodiversity immediately with this process. And that we modeled it out and we figured out that it would, after even 50 years, only about 1/3 of those carbon stocks would have been recovered. In fact, it would take an entire lifespan of a forest, which in this neck of the woods can be up to 3,000 years old, to fully recover the carbon pools. And it's for these reasons that Canada ranks as the 11th highest of 191 countries in carbon emissions. Although I would note that carbon emissions from forestry are not included in those calculations. But we do know from our own work that forestry emissions accounts for more than all of the other sectors combined in British Columbia. Now in 2017, wildfires started to really take off, and this intersects with forest management as well. And we all know what's happening now in the last 10 years. We've had the worst wildfires on record, which has to do with climate change and the intersection with forest practices. And so amidst all of this, an independent plan called the Old Growth Technical Advisory Plan, along with the Old Growth Strategic Review, did an analysis of what is remaining. They found that there is still a fair amount of primary forest, but of the tall tree ecosystems, these ecosystems, only about 3% remain. And so there were recommendations made, and one was to defer logging of all old growth forests, or many old growth forests, and to shift from a timber focus to an ecosystem health framework. Okay, so we were moving in that direction, and then Trump got elected. And so then things changed. And without the law changing, it's still legal to be harvesting these old growth forests. In fact, one of the nations I work for who are trying to buy back some of their tenures, they can't buy it back unless they follow the law in cutting down their forests. So, okay, so transformative changes are clearly needed. And I want to talk about what I see as what these changes could be in order to recover our healthy forests. And I want to start by saying I actually went down to the Amazon rainforest a couple of years ago in Ecuador, and I listened to shamans, and I had kind of this vision that what if we could stand our forests back up again? What if they were like this again? And how do we do that? And so I have some offerings here from my own thinking. They're multifaceted. Everything has to be multifaceted. It's not just one thing, but the law definitely plays an important role, as I've shown through this historical walk in the past. Here's what I think. I think, first of all, we need to reassess how we view forests, not just something to exploit as things, but as part of our environment, our life support systems. And to realign our world values that follow the natural laws that are based in respect for all living things, our connections, our relationships, and looking after our home, Mother Earth, for present and future generations. And we need to get the world on board through education and advocacy based on truth, and to work generously with people and the more than human world, not just with a select few. And this means honoring traditional rights and title and sovereignty. And I would say what some of my Indigenous colleagues say, the land is missing us. We need to return the people to the land. We need to support youth in becoming involved in this, in advocating for their future, encouraging them to do this, providing them with the instruments to do this. We need to invest in emerging marketplaces that actually value forests for their the economic value of ecosystem health. This is already happening and needs to be supported. So Chris mentioned the carbon markets and pricing on carbon. That's an important tool. Right now, at $80 per ton, that is in the compliance market of Canada, and it's also available in the voluntary market with good buyers. That carbon is worth about $80 a ton. At that kind of price, when we evaluate the forests of the Pacific Coast, one of the evaluations showed that the forest is actually worth 5 times more in carbon than in cutting it down for timber products right now. So we need to encourage that. We also, of course, need to change this ownership and this tenureship system and honor the laws that are coming into place, like through the United Nations, honoring the DRIPA, Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so that we can return rightful ownership and jurisdiction back to the people, Indigenous people, local communities, and I think, more away from the multinational corporations who don't seem to care about our forests. And finally, the law. The law plays a huge role, and health scientists also play a huge role in implementing new laws. So as I said, right now it's illegal not to cut. It's illegal to not cut old growth and primary forests. This needs to change. And there are many laws that are coming online, and there's lots of precedents that have been set over Indigenous sovereignty, and I'm sure you know that case law much better than I do. There's also law that's emerging around climate change and biodiversity and human rights. I think that those laws and those emerging cases are really important to follow, but also the rights of nature laws. And the United Nations has just passed a resolution that humans have a right to a clean and healthy environment that can set a benchmark or a precedent against which cases can be litigated. And these rights-based cases are emerging around the world. starting especially and put forward by Indigenous people in particular, because they have the most to lose. And that's their homes. So they've emerged in Colombia, Ecuador, New Zealand, Costa Rica, and recently in Canada. The Innu people actually were litigated for the rights of the Magpie River in Quebec. So as a scientist, I feel like I can be very helpful in this process of creating new laws. And I think that we can play really key roles, and we're here to do that, to help. So we can help in identifying the cases where, because we have the data, we're eyes on the ground, we're working, and we're measuring the impacts of these forest practices on the environment. We can be helpful in identifying who's responsible for these injuries to the environment and to the people. We can help identify who are the victims of the environmental degradation. We can identify the amount of emissions and setting baselines for what those emissions are, what the biodiversity losses are that can be used in litigation. As I said, we can help set baselines for healthy environments. We can look to the past and do forensic ecology and say, this is what it was like before. We can also help determine appropriate remedies, how to restore the land, how to make restitution for people that have been injured. So I think I'll just conclude that, I'm really encouraged by new laws, new policies, new rights laws, and that we as scientists play an important role, and we would like to work with you in advancing this. So thank you very much.